What is the import of the latest government shutdown circus, and how does it differ from the debt ceiling circus of a couple of months ago? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, welcome back to the Libertarian Angle. Let me just preliminarily let everybody know that we've got our new online series of presentations that's going to start this coming Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register on our website. It's the theme of the series is How I Discovered Austrian Economics. And we're going to be featuring major figures in the Austrian economics movement, including Richard here. Our first presenter is Ben Powell, who teaches economics at Texas Tech University. A fantastic guy. And what we wanted to do with this series is not present some academic kind of talks that might tend to put people to sleep, including maybe me, but really just informal, personal kind of talks on how these Austrian figures discovered Austrian economics, sort of a personal story account, how it impacted their lives, where it led them, what are some of the big principles of Austrian economics that impacted them, and just make it a fun, intellectually enjoyable experience. And so we invite you to subscribe rather than just wait for the video where you just watch it and participate in the activities here. We're going to have an extensive Q&A session. And so it's going to be a intellectually fun event. That's the purpose of it. First time out this Thursday night. I don't think anybody's ever done anything like this in the libertarian movement. It's going to be a first for FFF, and I think you're going to truly enjoy this. So again, just register on our website at fff.org. You'll get a Zoom link, and you get to participate on this Thursday night at 7 p.m. All right, Richard, we just got over another threatened shutdown of the federal government. Mainstream press was going ballistic again, as it did a couple of months ago with the threatened shutdown from the debt ceiling. Now, when you and I addressed this threatened shutdown from the possible shutdown that was coming about because of the debt ceiling debate, the natural tendency would be to think, oh, well, this is over. I mean, there's no more threatened shutdowns because the debt ceiling was extended over to after the election in 2024, putting everybody at ease, at least in the political arena. And yet here we are facing another threatened shutdown. Now, they averted it at the last minute on Saturday night, but as I understand it, it just extended the possible shutdown for another 45 days. So we're going to be going through this circus again. So explain to us what's going on here. Why is it that they were able to avert a shutdown with the debt ceiling debate a couple months ago, only to find ourselves with this same kind of circus a couple months later?
Well, because the issues have been different, Jacob. A few months ago, the issue was that the federal government had reached its congressionally approved maximum borrowing. The debt ceiling was at $32 trillion approximately. And the federal government had no authorization to borrow money to cover expenditures in excess of taxation. And that's what was settled at that time. Basically, the debt ceiling was lifted until January of 2025, at which the debt ceiling would come into effect again. So you have that approximately $32 trillion. And then whatever the government borrows and adds to the debt up until January 2025 is permitted. There's no limit, no restraint, no barrier. And then just whatever is the new debt level in 2025, January 20, that becomes the new debt ceiling, which would then require another congressional authorization to raise the debt ceiling again from that new higher level. What has arisen this time is that it's not a matter of whether the government can borrow or not. It's a matter Well, what will the government spend? And that requires congressional bills on domestic spending, on foreign spending, on defense spending. That has to be the usual procedure is bills begin in the House of Representatives, budgetary bills, that then passes to the Senate that may or may not have its own provisional version of this. They then go to a committee of reconciliation to make a bill that is uniformly the same for the both houses. Then both houses of Congress must again vote on it, the same agreed upon reconciled bill, which then goes to the president's desk. The difficulty that has happened now is that members of the House have not been able to agree on what would be in the bills. For example, there's been a controversy over should there or should there not be an increase in the allocated spending to support Ukraine against the Russian invasion. Should there be a movement to try to at least harness or reduce domestic spending to the level it was before the COVID crisis? And these controversies have prevented a decision and a reconciliation being made before this past weekend, when a stopgap bill was finally arranged between the two houses, which has now gone to Biden's desk, which he signed off, which has delayed having to deal with the actual budgetary bills, the spending bills, until 45 days from now. But a month and a half from now, we're going to be back to the same position. That is, what will be the authorized spending of the federal government on defense, on various domestic spendings, on discretionary levels, on foreign aid, to any additional military or other assistance to Ukraine. So this is going to be played out because it has nothing to do with the debt. The Congress has given itself authorization to spend as much as it wants, including borrowed money. What it can't agree upon is what should the actual spending be, regardless of whether it's tax money or borrowed money. And that's the dilemma we're in, because there are those who want to see a restraint in government spending, maybe certainly not anywhere near a classic liberal or libertarian in the way that we would normally talk about the size and scope and legitimate functions of government. But in comparison to what government has been, there are some members of Congress who would like to see a restraint or an actual reduction. That is not consistent with most other members in Congress believe, who are very satisfied with the welfare state continuing, no programs being cut, expenditures expanding in many directions, both foreign and domestic. And this is the dilemma. And the closeness of the votes in the houses result in this dilemma just continuing. And the same will repeat itself. But my general prediction, however, is that, and it's one that we both pointed out when variations on this theme have been discussed before on this program, is that it's all smoke and mirrors. The fact is they don't want a shutdown, or if a shutdown occurs, they want to just limit it to some narrow period of time, because the fact is the government keeps functioning. There are essential workers and non-essential workers. Of course, you might ask the question, if they're non-essential, why do we even need them? But this is the terminology that you know, the bare bones skeleton without which the government cannot function, the really essential workers. They're furloughed. Those who are viewed as non-essential are furloughed. And once the budgetary bills or the debt ceiling is raised again by both houses and signed off by the president, as required by the Constitution, all of those furloughed workers not only are back on salary, they get paid all the money that had not been allocated or spent on them before. So in other words, they do not go 2 weeks or a month without pay. It'll just be paid back to them retroactively, even if they've sat at home doing nothing on the furlough. Now, I have to say, and this is just me, I would rather pay them to do nothing. If we got to pay them, okay, we're stuck with it. We're stuck with it. I'd rather pay them to sit at home doing nothing rather than interfering in my life. They're not passing regulations. They're not imposing regulations. They're not inspecting. They're not restricting. They're not prohibiting. They're not demanding. They're just at home watching television, waiting for their furloughed retroactive pay. So I want it. Just leave me alone. I'll pay you to leave me alone. Now, obviously, I'm being sarcastic here, but this is just the reality. It says, oh, these workers, how are they going to live? How are they going to function? Let me just add a proviso to this. So when was this shutdown to occur? Midnight on September 30th. All federal workers received their September 30th check. The issue was, would they have received a check in the middle of October, their October 15th check? They're paid every 2 weeks. It's not as if over the next 2 weeks they didn't have paid. They just got paid. It's a question, would they have received the October 15th check, the October 30th check, the November 15th check? That was the whole issue. So it's not as if these poor people were going to be told, go home and you don't get a check. They just got their check. But it's all a circus and smoke and mirrors, because nobody wants a shutdown, because then government isn't doing what everybody in Congress and so many special interest groups want government to do. And it would just be a political disaster for everyone if it were to shut down and continue permanently from a political point of view. So this is just another game that'll be played 45 days from now with the same result.
Yeah, you say nobody wanted a shutdown, but I really think those non-essential workers did want to shut down. I mean, like you point out, it's a paid vacation.
Correct. But you see, they don't want a shutdown that results in them never coming back to work.
Oh, of course not. But they know as a practical matter, that's never going to happen because of this joint commitment to the welfare warfare state. They know, based on history of these so-called shutdowns, that as soon as the government is put back to work, they get their pay retroactive. Right. So it's really a vacation. Now, they can't travel to Europe or something because they could be called back immediately. But they can stay. They can have a stay-at-home vacation. They can go to the beach if it's nearby. I mean, this is a paid vacation for these people. And of course, there's different interpretations of what is essential or not essential. I'm not even sure they use that term anymore because there were many of the non-essentials that were so psychologically and emotionally distraught after one of these shutdowns and being considered non-essential that they had to really deal with this. And I think they changed the classification to something else. But their interpretation of non-essential, I don't know what it is, but my hunch is that like 70% is essential and maybe 30% is non-essential. While from your and my perspective, 95% would be considered non-essential.
Well, what they try to do, Jacob, and this has happened several times when they've had these shutdowns, they want to make it starkly inconvenient for Americans. Like, I know you're on vacation in Washington, D.C., but the Washington Monument is closed. Oh, I know that you've driven all the way across the country to go to Yellowstone Park, but I'm sorry, the restrooms are closed. You're going to have to do it out in the forest with the bears. It's meant to be irritating to the average American. It's done on the things that are trivial, but irritating to people who suddenly find they can't go to the bathroom.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. They will pick out the areas where they know that Americans will get upset over all this happening. And then they pick on those areas. And then they like, I wouldn't be surprised if they say, well, we have no choice but to cancel Social Security checks. And it's this huge uproar because they're going to pick out the areas that they know are going to anger people. And then that starts the pressure to reopen the government. But, one of the fascinating phenomena I see in this also is the mainstream press, because during the debt ceiling debate and in every debt ceiling debate, they have the Chicken Little. Oh, default. There's going to be a default. Oh, my gosh. And you see all these extensive editorials and op-eds, which they trot out from the previous time. All they do is just reprint their old op-eds and editorials saying, oh, if there's a default, then America's going to go under and this is horrible. And so this huge hue and cry over default. But as soon as the crisis is over, as soon as the debt ceiling is raised, which enables the government to borrow more money, they don't say a word. You never hear from the Chicken Littles again. They don't say, okay, we're going to write a series of op-eds and editorials here saying you need to rein in federal spending, because now that we've gotten through this debt ceiling, we're going to reach the next one. And so you got to start cutting now. You never see this. Instead, they just laugh. They pull out the champagne bottles, they uncork them, and they say, "We did it again. We brought up all the fear mongering that caused them to do this." And then you know darn well that after the elections in 2024, when the debt ceiling's reached again, they'll just pull out their same op-eds and editorials, put a new date on them, put a couple of new figures in there, and trot out the same darn argument, Richard. And
we basically see this because the fact is that across the ideological spectrum in the United States, the fact is that there is no movement, no commitment, no sense of a desire to cut down the size of government. Now, obviously, there are individual Americans, some of whom hold classical liberal or libertarian views like ourselves, some people who would consider themselves politically or philosophically, fiscally conservative. But the fact is, the vast majority of the American population and those who are involved in the political process don't want to see a cut. Those involved in the political process see it as a way to always be promising something to someone for electoral purposes. And then in the general public, the fact is, if you talk to people, yes, government spends too much. Government is out of control. Something has to be done with the debt. But if you talk to members of the American public, the vast majority of them say yes to all that until you start mentioning specific programs that would have to be either cut back or abolished to bring in, to rein in the size and scope and spending of the government. Do you think government spends too much? Yes. What if that means a 50% cut in Social Security, or a 30% cut in Medicare, Medicaid, or a reduction in unemployment insurance, or a cutback on military bases around the country, or a reduction of foreign aid, military assistance to foreign countries, which then reduces the government contracts to defense sectors of the U.S. economy. Suddenly, once you say these things, you finally find that nobody wants a cut in government. What they want is other programs cut, not the ones that they favor or benefit from. And when you have that type of a musical chairs, the problem is the game just goes on and the music never stops and it just keeps getting worse.
Yeah, because it's always somebody's income. I mean, they can call it waste, fraud, and abuse, but what you're talking about, checks being given to real people, all of whom consider it a disaster to lose those checks, whether you're talking about Social Security recipients or Medicare recipients or the vast military industrial complex. Nobody wants to give up his check. And that's the core of the problem. And as you point out, there's not a large constituency to start abolishing these socialist programs, welfare state programs, warfare state programs. And as I've long said, we can't predict when this thing's going to end up happening, but this is not going to end well if you stay on this trajectory. Now, let me bring up another point, Richard, though, that they brought up in this latest debate, and I'm sure we're going to see it again 45 days from now. It's this argument that if you terminate government spending, like with a temporary shutdown, there's tremendous harm to an economy. I mean, we can understand this argument with respect to the private sector, like during the COVID shutdowns, when so many businesses shut down, there was really a negative effect on economic activity and economic prosperity. But they're saying that when the government shuts down, that these people are not going to be receiving their paycheck, and therefore it's going to harm economic activity. They're not going to be able to go out and spend money at the mall and so forth. For me, that is a totally fallacious notion, because they're treating the government just as any other private sector actor in the marketplace. They're treating the government like Walmart or Target or consumers and so forth, when really the government sector is totally different from the private sector. Do you agree? And if so, explain to us what's going on here.
Well, I think what you're trying to get at is that wealth in the private sector is generated by private enterprise. That is, people have to devote resources, raw materials, investment in capital, guided by entrepreneurial insight and technological innovations to produce desired products. And people are employed from the top to the bottom to participate in this. So if you do like government did in February of 2020 and tells people do not produce, do not go to work, do not go shopping, do not leave your apartment except for essential shopping that we define as certain types of food purchases, certain types of medical purchases at the pharmacy, the economy implodes. You cannot consume unless you've produced. You cannot demand unless you have supplied. Those are core, inescapable laws of economics and the reality of the world in which we live. So to shut down the private sector in this way, and by the way, the COVID episode was probably the first time in American history that an economy was crashed into a recession as an intentional policy of the government, right? One would think that other booms and busts, it's not the purpose of the policymakers, the politicians to do things to intentionally cause a collapse of the economy for whatever period of time. But this was intentional. No, people can't be near each other. No, we can't have people interacting with each other. They're going to spread the virus. So we are intentionally shutting down the economy. We are intentionally inducing a severe recession. This happened in February of 2020. By April, as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, unemployment had reached practically 15% from 3.5 in a matter of 3 months. I mean, output fell dramatically. GDP fell by 34% in the second quarter of 2020. This was a government-induced, intentionally caused collapse of the economy, a recession. And that's catastrophic. But the difference is that government does not produce. It only consumes. It only has two sources of revenue. It doesn't produce goods and services. It's not innovative. It siphons off wealth from others. It only spends what it either taxes from the citizens or borrows from other citizens based upon those citizens' productive work. So if government spending decreases or ends in direction A, B, and C, all it does is free up resources that the government has been spending and sucking up and available for private sector uses. Now, it would help if at the same time that the government spending was cut, that you also reduced taxes so that actual money was put back in people's pockets who had honestly earned it to spend it the way they want now. In other words, increase their demands in other directions that now the government isn't drawing resources into. But as a matter of principle, the government is just spending other people's money, either directly by taxing you and me and spending it, or borrowing other people's money and spending it, which is just supposedly a promise to pay back in the future. So either way, government is not producing anything. Government is not generating any wealth. It is merely redistributing it from members of the private sector to itself and merely redirecting how dollars are spent and how resources are allocated. It's not an essential source itself of production and employment.
Yeah, that's what we call the unseen consequences of government action. I mean, you can look at a military base and say, oh, look at the military base, the prosperity it brings a community, and look at all the bars that form around the military base. And if we have a shutdown of the government, boy, think of the disastrous effect that will have. Well, the fact is that as libertarians, Richard, we would shut down most of these military bases. Is that going to be a detriment to the economy? Well, it'll be a detriment to the people that are on this military dole, either directly or indirectly. But as you point out, what about the people whose money has been taken from them through taxation or borrowing that is funding this monstrosity over here? If you shut down the monstrosity, all of a sudden the people who are having their money taken from them are no longer having their money taken from them.
Yes.
They have their money now, and they're able to invest it or save it or spend it. In other words, they're part of the productive sector. A simple way to look at this is, suppose we live in a society that America was based on, say, 1890, where people keep 100% of their income. There's no income tax. So they're investing, they're spending, whatever, they're producing wealth with all this money. Suddenly the government says, we're going to take a third of your income. Every year, we're going to take a third of it, and we're going to use it to build this monstrosity of a welfare warfare state. Well, now the people in the private sector have 1/3 less of their income to put to their use, to save or spend or invest in whatever. So when we come along as libertarians and say, no, let's restore the original system. Let's have the shutdown of these government operations so that people can have 100% of their income again. All of a sudden, all these chicken littles, oh no, there's going to be damage to the economy because government won't be able to spend this money. Well, what they're ignoring is that the people that they're taking money from have been deprived of the right and the opportunity to dispose of their wealth the way they want. And that's why the government sector is totally different from the private sector. It's like a parasite. That if you remove the parasite, that enables the victim of the parasite to bloom and prosper. And that's all we want to do, is eliminate the illegitimate functions of government, which means a permanent shutdown of these illegitimate functions. That's not a damage to the economy, as these people would say. It's actually a benefit to the economy.
Yeah, a large portion of what the government spends clearly is borrowed money. If the government wasn't borrowing that money, that's savings in the financial institution for which lenders are looking for credit-worthy borrowers. Because if you don't lend the money, you're not earning interest income. And if you're not earning interest income, neither the depositors who have left their money with you, nor you as the middleman are earning anything. So as a consequence, if the government borrowing is either reduced or stopped, a balanced budget, then all that happens is that portion of the saved scarce wealth of the society that the government was siphoning off in its direction would be available to be lent to private borrowers who meet credit-worthy and business planning standards that banks loan officers evaluate, and it would just be used to invest in more machinery, more tools, more equipment designed to make products that consumers want, which results in a higher standard of living for all down the future. So moving resources, whether taxed or borrowed, from the hands of the government and moving it back into the private hands where it originated and should belong would just be a boon to the economy. Yes, it is absolutely true, as you've said. If the government shuts down a military base, those private enterprises orbiting the base in that geographical area will obviously have fallen off. Restaurants, apartment complexes, some suburban communities where officers or enlisted men live with their families. All of these seems to be a decrease, but it also means that the money that is no longer being spent there would be spent maybe even partly in the same communities in different ways, but in just different parts of the country. The dollars would be spent where the income earners want it to be spent, on the goods and services they value, for the purposes that they have in mind for themselves and their families and so on, or to be expanding businesses and factories and retail stores in either that part of the country or other parts of the country. So there is, on principle, no net decrease in employment once the adjustments have been made. There's no net decrease in investment. In fact, it would be used for productive profit-making purposes rather than the wasted dead ends of government spending in general. So as a consequence, the economy would benefit from it, which means each of us would benefit from it in the long run if government's hand could be taken out of our pockets.
Yeah, to take it to an extreme example, suppose the government said, we're going to start confiscating 95% of people's wealth or income, and they get to keep 5%. And this goes on for 20 years. And all of a sudden, we libertarians come along and say, well, no, we want to restore people's income to themselves. The government would say, no, this will be a disaster for the economy because the government won't be able to spend this 95% that they've just been plundering and looting from people's income. And our argument would be, let people have their own income and decide for themselves what to do with it. That's where real prosperity comes. And also, Richard, as we've focused on over the years, the key to rising standards of living comes not from consumption, it comes from savings. As people save more money, They put it into banks, and then businesses are able to borrow it, and then they buy equipment that makes workers more productive, and more productivity means more income, higher wage rates, and higher standards of living. To that extent, the more the government crowds out borrowing savings from people by borrowing this money, to that extent they're lowering people's standard of living, or to the extent that they're taxing people money that would have gone into savings, they're lowering people's standard of living. And let's face it, the more people make an income, the more they're able to save. The more the government takes from them in terms of taxation, the more difficult it is to save. And the more difficult it is to save means lower standards of living.
Absolutely. So the answer to this is not to be taken in by all the shutdown propaganda, whether it be raising the debt ceiling, or the fear of not being able to agree on government bills and expenditures. The real issue is, what is it that government should be spending money on? If government exists, what are its reasonable and rational and justifiable duties and responsibilities and functions? And beyond that, we should be challenging why government is spending money on X, Y, and Z when it should be limited to A, B, and C.
Okay, on that excellent note, we'll wrap things up. Again, keep in mind that Thursday night, 7 p.m., our first presentation in an online conference series, How I Discovered Austrian Economics, Ben Powell. I guarantee you're going to love this talk. It's going to be fun. It's going to be intellectually enjoyable. It's not going to be an academic talk. It's going to be a fun intellectual experience and provide real insight into the role that Austrian economics plays in the libertarian movement, and really is the key to getting America out of the economic morass in which we find ourselves. Registered at our homepage at FFF.org in the multimedia section there, upcoming events section, and you'll get your Zoom link, and you get to participate in the Q&A session of the event. Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. As always, I look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Until next time.